Hi everyone, I'm Gerlitz, and as you just said, I'm going to present the paper Evolution of Password Expiry in Companies, Measuring the Adoption of Recommendations by the German Federal Office for Information Security. And I worked on this with my colleagues Maximilian Häring, Matthew Smith, and Christian Tiefenau. So let's start with a look at the timeline. By 2013, it was clear that it's not such a good idea to force users to regularly update their passwords. And this was again shown in the following years. In 2016, NIST then finally adapted to this and deleted their recommendation to use password expiry. In 2019, we conducted a survey in German companies to understand the current policies in German companies. And the German Federal Office for Information Security at that time still recommended a regular change. And so it's no big surprise that 70% of the German companies in fact use password expiry at that point. However, shortly afterwards, they also deleted their recommendation for password expiry. And so we were left with the question, how did this change the password policies and especially the password expiries in companies? So to answer our question, we conducted 3 expert surveys after the BSI changed their recommendation. And with the previous one, we had 4 data sets we could use. The first one from 2019 from the previous paper, shortly before the recommendation change, and then 3 afterwards. 1 from the end of 2020, 1 from the beginning of 2022, and from the last one was conducted at the beginning of this year. We recruited over the BSI newsletter and specifically targeted those who work in a position where they could change the policy or at least have a detailed understanding of how the current situation is. In fact, we sampled several CISOs or information security officers. We also had administrators, and we also had people from the management, for example, CEOs who answered our survey. And we asked for the password policy and authentication system in general, and also added very specific questions for password expiry and alternative checks at the beginning of this year. So first I will present the most common elements of password policies that were mentioned in our survey, namely the number of required character classes, the required minimum length, and whether passwords need to be changed on a regular basis just based on time alone. Starting with the number of required character classes. So in 2019, we had some people who mentioned 1 or 2 classes that are required in the passwords, but the majority focused on 3 or 4 character classes. And then we had some people who didn't really specify what they were using or didn't have a policy at all. And when we look at the following years, we see that this picture does not change that much. There are some small shifts, but the majority still focuses on 3 or 4 character classes. And at this point, I want to point out that while NIST excluded the recommendation to require several character classes, the Federal Office for Information Security just rephrased this and now state that passwords should be sufficiently complex and difficult to guess. And they even have an example that include 4 character classes. So we weren't too surprised by this result. Moving on to the minimum length of user-chosen passwords. So in 2019, 50% of the companies used a minimum length of 8 or less. 15% each a minimum length between 8 and 10 or between 10 and 12, and only around 5% had a minimum length greater than 12. And again, there were those who didn't really specify what they were using. Looking at the following years, fewer and fewer participants mentioned a minimum length of 8 or less. Instead, more participants now use more than 10 or even more than 12 characters as a minimum length for employee passwords. And when it comes to password expiry, what was removed from the recommendation, we had around 70% of the participants in 2019 who said that they make use of it. And only 25% either didn't mention it or explicitly stated that they are not using it. And now looking at the following, we again had those who didn't say anything about it. And now looking at the following years, requiring regular changes became less common, and the number of those who explicitly not use it or didn't say anything about it rose. And as we hypothesized something like that or hoped for it, we performed a Fisher's exact test for the data from 2019 and 2023, and in fact saw that this is a significant change. So taken together, there's a trend to longer minimum length and using no password expiry in companies for employee passwords. And this trend can also be seen when looking at the elements in combination. So the most commonly mentioned combination in 2019, having to change your password every 90 days, having a minimum length of 8 and a complexity of 3, was not used in this year. And also vice versa, the most mentioned policy from this year, not mentioning an expiry, having a minimum length of 12 and also a complexity of 3, was not used in 2019. And still, we have to mention that 45% still use password expiry. And as we suspected something like that, we were interested in understanding why. So we added a question at the beginning of this year to understand that, and we got 36 answers for that. And in the following, I will only summarize the most mentioned reasons for that. Most commonly mentioned was that password expiry is used to increase security. This was either very unspecific or with a more specific explanation, such as the following. Because after a year, the risk of misuse of the password through reuse with other potentially corrupted services is too great. So it seems that participants thought that they could improve the strength by using password expiry, which we know from related work does not really work, or to decouple the work account from private accounts. And I mean, in theory, that's a good idea, but I think there would be easier solutions to do that and more usable solutions. We also had some cases where participants seem to be not really sure about the effect it really has, for example, by stating that it adds some security. In other cases, another entity still demanded a regular change. So we had participants who mentioned that another governmental body next to the BSI still required the change, for example, by stating, officially, in my eyes, outdated requirements and handling officially classified data. And other mentioned internal policies. For example, a participant who stated, internal policies require this change, contrary to the recommendation of the IT security department. And especially connected to the latter one participant who was the CEO of a company said they believe that such decision should be made by management and not by the IT department. And I think that such statements show that it might be worth a try if recommendations or organizations that change recommendations could also give a good explanation for why it's happening, so that it might be easier for each department to argue necessary changes. And then we had participants who said that they simply have no alternative. So as previously mentioned, the BSI now recommends to use alternative checks instead of requiring regular changes. But several participants mentioned that there's a problem, for example, by saying there's currently no other technical solution. And this brings us directly to the next question. So how do companies check for compromised accounts? Currently, the Federal Office for Information Security does not give that many details on this, so we were interested in what companies did or why they did not do anything. And we again only asked this in this year and collected 66 answers. So those who check for compromised accounts or for a leak of the password mostly do that by checking for anomalies within the system. But nobody really specified what exactly this includes or what is not included. And almost a third of those who use checks check the passwords against the database of leaked passwords. Some also mentioned specific databases, such as have I been pwned. But again, most people did not really specify what exactly those checks include, so whether it's on a regular basis or just at the beginning, for example. And now coming to the probably more interesting one, those who didn't use checks most often said that it's just technically not straightforward and too difficult and that they simply do not know how to do that. Some others mentioned missing resources, for example, time, money, or simply human power that's missing. And others refer to structural or organizational issues. For example, the one I mentioned earlier where the management is kind of responsible for everything. And interestingly, 6 participants mentioned that they encouraged their employees to check for leaked passwords themselves, and I think 4 didn't have any technical checks in place. So in those cases, the employees are kind of responsible themselves that everything works well. So overall, our data shows that password expiry is still a thing, even 10 years after we decided that's not a good idea. And in some cases, it seems that participants have higher hopes on what it could help than what research suggests it really has. But this is what was not the only problem. So having to fight with the management or lacking knowledge about a quick and easy solution to check for compromise was also mentioned. And I think for us as researchers, it's important to understand the current landscape of tools that help to check for compromise, to understand the issue decision makers face by using them. And I think this is not only limited to passwords or password checks, but also to the next generation of authentication, for example, passwordless authentication. And finally, I believe that it might be worth a try to help experts in communicating important changes to the management. So it might be easier for them to argue necessary changes and to spend money and time, for example. And with that, I'm done. Thank you very much.